We know, thanks to a recent breakthrough, that it's possible to create a believable building in Planet Coaster using just a wooden plank piece. But what if we took this notion to the next level? What if we built a building using no scenery pieces and no building pieces whatsoever? Just roller coaster track. Now that is the question of today. Let's get started. Okay, so you're probably wondering, what are you doing and why are you doing this? But yeah, my idea for this video is to build a building 100% out of roller coaster track. And I know that last time I built a building using just a wooden plank piece, and the idea to build a building out of just roller coaster track has been in my mind for a while, but I always thought that it would be practically impossible for a good number of reasons. Well, I'll go into those reasons later, but I never really dared to do it. But after the one plank building, I felt like might as well try it. And it's really a bit of an experimentation in regards to what you can actually do with coaster track, because obviously you don't actually want to build a building out of just roller coaster track. You can probably tell by the length of this video that this turned out to be quite a struggle. And I didn't even include all of the footage of me working on this. Some parts of me just trying to figure stuff out or copying stuff around, I didn't even record in the first place. So yeah, you're probably wondering, why would you even do this? And personally, I thought it's a nice experiment to at least try and practice and do something fun with the game. Just kind of flex on you guys, I guess, because other than that, there's not much of a point anyway. But also, building elements out of roller coaster track is something that used to be really common in the Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 community. One example that always comes to my mind is HS Designs, also known back then as Hôtel Scorcho, who built a lot of very industrial scenery pieces just using roller coaster track. There's also the no custom scenery kind of community in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, which used roller coaster track to make supports for other roller coasters. And I know a guy called Leon used to build Asian roofs using wooden roller coaster track. So there are lots of fun ways that you can experiment with roller coaster track, and I think it's something that within the Planet Coaster community is kind of underutilized. And you definitely shouldn't go ahead and build complete buildings out of exclusively roller coaster track like I'm doing in this video, because as you can probably tell, it's really annoying. And I'll explain in a bit why, if you can't see it already, because clearly I'm struggling to build a pillar here. But I think every now and then there are scenery elements that you can definitely build out of roller coaster track, and it can be a fun way to experiment with the game and add some very unique pieces to it. So especially in industrial or cyberpunk or steampunk themes, I think roller coaster tracks can really help build steel lattice structures or build very organic elements with a lot of curves and things like that. It's definitely something to keep your eye out for. And if you ever, don't have much of an idea of what you want to do and want to experiment a bit and see what works, roller coaster track is in there in your scenery arsenal, and I can really recommend everyone to just remember that, never forget it, and always remember that when you're running out of scenery piece ideas, the roller coasters can be used as scenery as well. Just remember to disable collisions, because that's really the entire idea that makes this viable at all. Also, side note, I'm sorry if my voice doesn't sound too great. I still have a cold and my nose is a bit iffy and my throat is a bit sore. So yeah, it can't be helped. I'm gonna need to play Planet Zoo soon, so I'm gonna have to record stuff anyway. But I hope it's not too much of a nuisance. Anyway, I was going to explain what makes this so difficult, and also partly what made me confident that I could actually do this. So first of all, the things that make this possible. For one, we have the T-Rex track, the monorail coaster track, and this is the majority of coaster track that will be featured in this building. Easily, as you can see here, everything that I've built so far is all using the monorail coaster track, just because this track is a big block of one color, so you can pretty much make anything out of this. There's nothing that really sticks out. So it's super useful, and it's what I'll be making the majority of this build out of. I don't think that I would have even tried this without the T-Rex track in the game. What also makes this possible is, like I said, the fact that you can disable collisions in the game settings mean that you can intersect roller coaster track in any way that you want, which is really helpful. Although you can't intersect stations into each other, so that's why I keep having to build the station to start the coaster off with a little bit further away from where I'm actually building. So that's a bit of a challenge. And also, you can recolor track pieces in any way that you want, and you can select any track piece and give it a different color. And usually this is not very useful. I don't think you realistically want a single coaster to have all kinds of different color schemes throughout its layout. But in this case, it's actually amazing, and I wouldn't have been able to do this without that recolorability option either. Because obviously I want different elements of the building to have different colors, and since I can't really work with textures, I needed to find other way to make textures work. So in this case, for instance, the pillars have a slightly darker beige-ish color than the walls on the background to make them stand out. And for the foundational walls, I'm using horizontal track pieces to clearly kind of actually imitate the granite foundation walls that you find on a lot of classical buildings in real life. But then for the rest of the walls, I'm using these vertical track pieces, which isn't necessarily the most realistic texture. It looks more like a Victorian wooden wall than it does an actual wall for a classical building. But I think it works out to distinguish these different parts of the wall from each other, and the fact that they have slight color differentiations, and the fact that even some of the vertical wall pieces, you can see there's a different color next to each other, which is kind of giving it a bit more of a texture than it otherwise would have had. So the fact that you can actually change colors is absolutely amazing. That said, there are things that make this really, really difficult, and one thing that made this so difficult that I didn't really think about beforehand is the fact that a blueprint or a selection or even a part of the map that you want to delete may never contain more than 5 coasters. So you cannot save more than 5 coasters in a blueprint, but you also can't move more than 5 coasters at the same time, and you can't even delete more than 5 coasters at the same time. And because a lot of these pieces are made out of different roller coasters, that means that I can't move stuff around very easily. Now there is a way to work around this, but this is also very difficult, and yeah, it kind of makes this a bit harder as well. And that is that I make every element out of a single roller coaster. So each of those pillars, for instance, is one roller coaster. The entire wall is one roller coaster. And then the balustrade on top of it is actually a different roller coaster. That's an RMC hybrid coaster. It fits perfectly for the balustrade. But yeah, you get the idea. Every element is one roller coaster, maybe a few more for just some detailing elements, but it can't be too many, because then you can't save it as a blueprint, and I needed to save all of these pieces as a blueprint if I wanted this to be doable at all. Because I do want to, build a certain piece and then be able to copy it around and edit on all the different parts of the building. And this is really a major challenge, because if you think about it, in Planet Coaster, the core game mechanic I think that makes it possible to build buildings the way that you do in Planet Coaster is the fact that you can select different pieces, group them together, and move them around using the 3D gizmo. And I can't do any of that with this build, because everything is to be built out of roller coaster track, and it just can't be moved and manipulated in the same manner. So yeah, that was kind of difficult, and because of that there are also some details that are slightly off on the pillars, for instance. You can see that everything doesn't exactly line up. It's really hard to get things to line up correctly when you're just using roller coaster track, because any time that you want to move anything, you cannot move individual pieces of track. You just have to build this whole section of track to go to a different place, then build that piece of track, and afterwards remove all of the track that you used to get to that position. So that's what you see me doing most of the time here, just trying to figure out how I can build a layout of track to get back to a certain position to build what I want to build. And all of this makes it very time consuming to build a building out of roller coaster track in Planet Coaster. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't recommend it. This is really just an experiment, a little cheeky test to see how it works. But yeah, it's not very practical. But that said, if you are just building regularly and you're building with regular scenery and building elements like a normal person, then you can definitely experiment a bit with coaster track to make some elements that would otherwise be really difficult to make. I have to say, I also didn't make it too easy on myself by trying to build what I'm trying to build, which is some kind of classical Renaissance building with a traditional front with a pediment, pillars, architrave, frieze, etc. With a dome behind it, which we'll get to in a minute. This is definitely not the easiest thing to build with roller coaster tracks, so maybe I could have made my own life a bit easier, but I just really wanted to try this. Especially after I had the idea to twist different roller coaster tracks into each other to make the pillars, and to make the pillars actually look like they have these grooves that they do in real life, which I think works out pretty well. I think for me at least, the thing that mostly sells this build is the fact that the pillars look pretty decent, if you don't count their tops and bottoms, which are a bit weird. Anyway, I skipped ahead a bit here to go into my experimentation with the dome that's going to be on top of the building. And this was actually a little bit less of a struggle, I think, than most detailing, because roller coaster tracks, of course, are very good at making curves, so making the dome wasn't too annoying. The bad part about this is yet to come, and that is trying to get different pieces to line up to actually make a dome structure, rather than just a two-dimensional dome cutout. But yeah, so far, so good, honestly. Now, another thing that made this really difficult eventually is the fact that you can't move stuff around like you can with regular scenery pieces, which is enough of a struggle while you're still building, but it becomes really difficult to alter your building after you're done putting things in place. And that, I think, was the major struggle in making this building look decent and making the composition of it look alright. Because as soon as you put anything in place, as soon as anything starts looking enough like the thing that you're going for, you can't really move it around anymore, because once this dome is completely built, for instance, it'll be built out of 30 different coasters, and I can't grab the whole thing and move it around. I could grab the different elements and move those around, but that's not the most practical thing either. So yeah, you have to more or less get things right from the get-go, or it's going to be difficult much later on. So yeah, that was a big struggle. And I should also say, and this is something that you might notice already, because even on this recording, which is 12 times sped up, there are some lag spikes, because the game started protesting against me building this. And I was not expecting this at all, but the frame rate became absolutely horrendous at the end of this build. And I'm also not sure exactly how it worked, because sometimes it would just be terrible for a few minutes, and afterwards I would have a decent frame rate, somewhere between 20-30 FPS for a bit, and then it would become terrible again. I really don't know why it did that, but absolutely the worst thing, and something that you might have noticed when I was trying to save the dome as a blueprint, is the fact that any time that I tried saving a blueprint, the game would just freeze for a few minutes. And yeah, that was really annoying, and also gave me a heart attack every time, because anytime the game freezes, I just kind of feel like it might crash any second. But especially for this build, because blueprints are the only way that I can save different elements and move them around. The fact that making blueprints took such a long time was a bit annoying. I also didn't save the game very often, because saving also took a few minutes anytime I tried to do it. So yeah, I really wasn't expecting this, but building a lot of roller coaster track really makes the game run very poorly. And I know it doesn't necessarily seem like there's a lot of roller coaster track in here, but between all of the rotating track pillars and all of the walls being made out of many meters of track, there is an insane amount of roller coaster track in this building already. So I'm not going to blame Planet Coaster for having a terrible performance when I'm doing something that the game was never supposed to do anyway, but it's something that made this a whole lot more difficult, and it's definitely something that I didn't see coming when I went into this. I should also say, for some of you people who watched the wooden plank building and said, man, you put flowers on top of this building which you said would only contain wooden plank, that's cringe, bro, you're gonna lose subscriber. Well, to those people, I'm gonna have to say that today I'm not going to put anything on top of this building, or any extra scenery elements on any of the balustrades or flowers next to any of the windows. This building is going to be 100% roller coaster track from top to bottom. I'm not going to cut any corners here. So yeah, I know that was all in good fun, and I know that was all jokes, but I take it very seriously. If I say that I'm building a building out of roller coaster track, I mean it, and I'm really not going to use anything else but roller coaster track. I'll put some foliage around this to provide a setting for it, but that's it. Everything you see is roller coaster track, no questions asked. So, moving on to a different part of the building here. The dome is all in place, and it's time to add a roof to this bad boy. And yeah, this is RMC monorail track, as you were probably expecting. And funnily enough, because of the texture and the fact that it's this kind of brownish grey color, it looks very much like a metal sheet roof, and quite a good one at that. You could almost use this as a regular metal sheet roof in any park. If it weren't for the fact that it was a bit annoying to build and might lag up your computer a bit, I think it actually works decently well. But yeah, at this point, I had to save some of the pillars, move them around, copy some of the elements that I already put on the front of the building around to the different sides of the building, so that the building actually looks believably like it's developed around all the sides. Although I have to say, I'm not really decorating the back side of this building, because I'm just gonna stick to the front. This is enough. But I do want there to be, you know, enough detailing that it looks like it could plausibly exist, and there's not just a gaping hole at the back, which doesn't look anything like the front does. But it's also made a bit difficult by the fact that we don't have the grid to help us out here, because normally when you build stuff, the grid is also quite handy to get things lined up and to get the positions correct, to get the distances between different parts of the building right. But in this case, I basically just have to randomly place stuff down and try as much as I can to match them up to other parts of the building. So yeah, everything is probably a little bit off kilter, but that's something that I can't really help. I try to get them lined up as much as I could by doing it by hand. Now this is me finishing the dome. I wanted to add some of the steel lattice pieces of the Giga Coaster, which I think looks really good, to the dome, which is just about the best way that I could figure out how to fill in the dome. I was considering to make it a solid dome, but for one, that would have been really difficult to do with just roller coaster track. I would have to rotate a bunch of stuff around, and the beautiful dome method of the 3D gizmo that people normally use for building domes doesn't work, because you can't really easily 3D gizmo coaster track in place, because you cannot copy a coaster, which actually also, I should have probably clarified, you can't copy a coaster the way you do a scenery piece. You can really only blueprint them and get a new copy that way. Which means that you can't stay in the same position as a coaster that you might copy around, which means that the dome technique doesn't work. So yeah, for those reasons, I was not too happy trying to build a solid dome. But also, you know, I wanted to show off a little bit at least that this building is made out of roller coaster track and just have some completely exposed roller coaster track. So this dome is actually an iron open work dome made out of the T-Rex track and then some Giga Coaster track to provide some extra flavor, which I think works out quite well. Not to mention that open work domes I think actually look really cool, and I would have probably be building more of them in Planet Coaster if it weren't for the fact that glass and domes don't work too well together. I've seen people build domes out of glass in Planet Coaster, but I have an infinite amount of respect for people who have been able to do this, because I would honestly never. It's just so hard to get glass in the right position and get it not to overlap. So yeah, I would have been doing more of this kind of thing if it weren't so incredibly undoable. But in this case, I felt like an open work dome would actually fit the building quite well. Now that is the majority of the structure of the building in place actually. At this point I wanted to work on the windows, because obviously we don't have much detailing yet, and to make this feel like a believable building, I'm gonna need some windows and doors and things like that. So for the window I'm using the T-Rex track, of course, and underneath that frame, actually, I wanted to fill it in with T-Rex track as well, in a slightly bluish tint to make it seem like there's actually glass underneath that frame, which doesn't work the best. Obviously, a completely opaque texture isn't the best to imitate glass with. And also the color that I chose at first, which is this kind of baby blue color, I think is a bit too light and saturated, so that's something that I will adjust in a minute. But altogether, I think it works out reasonably well. It's a believable window, I think. And with this window, as for a lot of the building goes, that it looks much more believable from a distance. As soon as you get close by, you definitely realize that everything is made out of roller coaster track. But if you zoom out a bit and see things from a distance, I think it looks reasonably believable enough, so I'm happy with that. The only thing that I had to adjust after the fact, and I had to dig a hole underneath the building just to see what I was doing, is the fact that I wanted to make this window a bit more narrow, and I had to fill in the glass in the middle a bit better because it was still leaving empty spaces. So making sure that, you know, the entire window looked clean and it was filled in, but also none of the glass track pieces blend out of the frame. Doing that was a bit difficult and took a lot of trial and error. You know, the smaller you go in scale, the more difficult it becomes to build out of roller coaster track. Hence why I would never recommend to do this. So yeah, this was quite difficult to do. Speaking of which, I should also mention that the scale of this building is completely off. It's much larger than it should be, and in Planet Coaster things are typically already larger than they should be. So if you put a guest next to this building, they wouldn't even come up to where the pillars begin. They would only really come up to the top of the foundation of the pillars. So this building is absolutely enormous, probably 1.5 times bigger than it should be. But that's really just the scale struggle that I had trying to build a building out of coaster track. I don't think I could have made it smaller and still make it look believable. So I'm just going to try and scale up anything I can. So these windows are also really large. Any of the detailing that I'll add around it will be really large. And the foliage that I'll add in the end will also be made pretty much exclusively out of some of the biggest trees in the game, just to make this thing feel believable. I know that sounds like cheating a bit, but I think without the bigger scale, it would have been completely undoable. That was definitely one of my other breaking points that I had to consider. So yeah, I'm copying this window around just to make the building look a bit more believable, which I think it does a fair job at. But then I was trying to fill it into the dome section here, and I realized that the window was much too large for that. So I decided to set one window apart and try to work on it a bit, make it a bit more narrow and possibly taller, and just change the overall design of it, because typically, especially with these kinds of neoclassical buildings, you'll have different orders on different floors of the building. So because I have these arched windows on the ground floor, I wanted to have different type of windows on the second floor here, or the first floor, depending on where you're from and what it all means. Anyway, just underneath the dome. And yeah, just decided to go for some simple rectangular windows, which on their own don't work too well, but they fit very snugly between the pillars of the domed section of the building, and I think it works very well. It just, in general, it makes that whole section look better. Although I also have to say, on these windows especially, it becomes very clear that these are made out of roller coaster track. So especially for this domed section, you definitely want to zoom out a bit to keep that suspense of disbelief that it could be a real building and not just a total warbled mess of roller coaster track. A side note, don't ever watch this video while playing a drinking game where you take a shot every time I say roller coaster track. You'll get screwed up. Anyway, I just put in a door, which is basically a window with a different color, and that's it. That's basically the building finished, and at this point I started working on the surrounding area, which, funnily enough, made a huge impact, but when you compare it to the amount of time that it took me to build the building itself, it took barely any time to build the surroundings. Just plopping down a bunch of trees, putting some basic terraforming in. This is really not too relevant to the building itself, but it's just to provide a sort of realistic surrounding for the building, so that you can kind of imagine what it would look like in an actual setting. It's a bit of a strange setting because it's somewhere in the middle of a forest, whereas typically this kind of building would probably be somewhere in a city. But at least it makes it look a bit more believable than being in the middle of an empty sandbox, and I think it definitely makes a huge difference. Before I put all of these trees and ground shrubbery around it, I wasn't really too happy with the building, but now with all of the trees around it, I think it looks possible for a real building, and it looks decent enough. So I'm really happy with the way that it came out in the end. Anyway, that'll be it for this video. I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and if you stuck with me all the way through the end, then thank you, much respect. I know this has been a weird and probably boring and strange journey through the making of a building, but I thought it was a very interesting experiment. So yeah, thanks for watching again, and I hope to see you guys in the next video, which will hopefully be a bit more normal again.